Hi, this video is to help you guys with notebook samples number 5 and 6. Number 5 is the plain seam and number 6 is the basted seam. So important takeaways from these notebook samples is some vocabulary words, of course, actually. Starting with seam. So when we say the word seam, we're talking about joining two pieces of fabric. And it's important to note that that's different than just a stitch. Sometimes you can stitch a seam together, or sometimes you might just stitch one layer of fabric as well. But a seam is actually joining two pieces of fabric together. So when we do that, we need to know what is the right side of our fabric and the wrong side, because the way we place them together is important. So I have some fabric in front of me with a print on it. As a designer, you're probably going to choose the print as the correct side, the right side, and the back side would be the wrong side, if you will. For this notebook sample, you're going to want to cut out a swatch about 5 inches by 5 inches. The reason why we chose that length is just so that it would fit in your notebook sample. Let's see here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I have a ruler here. As you can see, I'm using a Sharpie marker. I would never do that on a garment I actually intend to wear, but for my notebook sample, because it's learning, I don't mind doing that. Let me see here. I'm just kind of marking where 5 inches is on my fabric, roughly. And then I have a plain weave fabric, so I don't actually have to cut it. I should be able to tear it. And it'll tear along my grain line and my cross grain and actually get a more straight swatch. There we go. Okay, so there's my 5 inch by 5 inch swatch. Because we're doing a seam, I need to connect two pieces of fabric. So I'm going to cut this guy in half so I can connect two pieces of fabric. So I'm just going to put a little snip right in the middle and tear it apart. Cool. Okay, now I am ready to join my two pieces with a plain seam, our first sewing sample that we're doing all semester. Okay, so right side of the fabrics, wrong side. The term you'll hear me say a lot this semester is join, is put your right sides together, raw edges even. So right side together, I'm gonna flip it. So then that way I only see the wrong side when I hold it. And then my raw edges even, this fabric where it's kind of fraying, we call that a raw edge. It's not a clean finish, it's not a seam, it's just raw edge. So I line up my raw edges so they're even. Take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew it together. Before we do that, it is important to note where to sew it. That's extremely important in order to get the correct fit. Seam allowance. So seam allowance is another vocab word. Usually the pattern that you sew, it will have a seam allowance dictated. Usually in our class, it's 5/8 inch if you're using a home pattern, or sometimes it's 1/2 inch. Sometimes with industry patterns, it might be 1/2 inch or even less. So it's very important to know what is the correct seam allowance to sew with in order to get the correct fit. Right now, because it's our first notebook sample that we're sewing, I'm just gonna mark 1/2 inch with my ruler and my Sharpie marker. So I'm lining up, 1/2 inch from the raw edge, and I'm just gonna draw a line. I would never do this with real fabric or a garment that I'm actually gonna wear because it would ruin my fabric. But for the sake of learning, I don't mind ruining my fabric. So there's my brown line. I need to sew exactly on that brown line. Now again, I can't mark every garment I'm gonna sew or I would be ruining it. So your sewing machine has engraved lines on the plate that are 1/2 inch away from the needle or 5/8 inch away from the needle. You'll notice fractions engraved on the throat plate. All you have to do is line up the raw edge along one of those engraved lines, and then your needle will automatically be however many inches away from the raw edge. So when I sew, I don't really look at my needle sewing my fabric. I actually like to keep an eye on my raw edge to make sure it's staying lined up with whichever engraved line on my throat plate is my seam allowance. So 1/2 inch, for example, for today. Okay, so I'm gonna go take this to the machine and I'm gonna sew it at 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm gonna line up my raw edge against the 1/2 inch line on the throat plate, and we're gonna sew up this seam. Okay, we're at my home sewing machine right now, and I have the camera facing our throat plate. And right here you will see some engraved lines and fractions. Every machine's different. Our classroom machines will say 1/2 for 1/2. This particular machine says 4/8 for 1/2. Then they have 5/8 and 6/8, which some people might say 3/4 as well. So I'm gonna sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I wanna line up my raw edge to stay even with this engraved line. The throat plates in the classroom, the fractions are not in the middle of the lines. They're over to the right of them. So some people get confused if the fraction is to the left of the line or to the right of the line. One way you can always check is just get a ruler and measure the distance from the needle to the engraved line, and that's going to be your seam allowance if you're ever not sure. Okay, so anyways, let's see here. So I'm going to pause. Okay, so I'm lining up my raw edge to stay in line with the engraved line that says 4/8 or 1/2. Once I'm ready, I lower my presser foot to hold its place. Don't ever forget to lower your presser foot. And now I'm ready to go ahead and to start sewing. So I'm gonna take a couple stitches, and then now I need to backstitch. Backstitch is when we sew 1 or 2 stitches backwards to lock our stitch. So on your machine, there should be a lever that you pull down, and then that will allow you to sew backwards. There we go, that's fine. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and keep sewing. Now my pin is getting close to my presser foot, so now is a great time to take out my pin. There we are. Okay. And then now why I sew, again, it's not my job to push the fabric forward. Really, my feed dogs underneath are pushing my fabric for me. My job is to just steer and to make sure that this raw edge stays aligned with the, the engraved line on the throat plate. Okay, now when we get to the edge of our fabric, on our single needle machines, we do not want to sew if there's no fabric, otherwise it causes a jam. So you want to get as close to the edge of the fabric as you can, and then go ahead and backstitch. Great. Now, when you're done, it's important that your take-up lever, which is right here on this machine, is at the highest position. A lot of home sewing machines will automatically have it lift to the highest machine, but our machines in the classroom will not. So make sure that take-up lever is as high as it goes. I think students just think the needle's up and they figure they can take their fabric out of the machine. But if your take-up lever is halfway down, then your thread is locked. And when you try to pull your fabric out of the machine, what happens is you end up bending your needle because the fabric's locked. It could even break your needle. So take a minute, make sure the lever's all the way up as high as you can go. You can use the hand wheel to get it up there. And then you can lift up your presser foot, pull your fabric to the back, and then just go ahead and cut off your thread. Okay, I want to take a minute to talk about pinning. It's extremely important to pin your fabric together in our class in order to have the most success. You want to do all the hard work before you go sit at the machine. That way when you're sewing, the sewing part is fun and easy, and all the work is done on the prep beforehand. So when we sew a seam, we take our right sides together, raw edges even, we line up our fabric. Now, if I just walk over to the sewing machine like this, there's a good chance my fabric's gonna slip out of place. So we wanna pin it together, okay? Now my seam that I'm gonna sew is parallel to my raw edges here. So keep that in mind as you pin your fabric. I see a lot of beginners want to pin their pins parallel with the raw edge, but you resist the urge. You actually need to pin them perpendicular. That way it's so much easier to take them out of the machine while you're sewing and your pin can stay in longer. So I'm gonna turn it around. I'm right-handed, so I like having the edges of my balls close to my right hand, so it's real easy to just pull out at the machine. Okay, so there's one pin. I space them, we're a beginner, so I recommend spacing them about every 3 inches or so. Something like that is fine. Yeah, and now this way my fabric's together, it's gonna be really easy to take it to the machine and I can feel confident that it's gonna stay in place. This is what our seam looks like when we are finished. You can see I backstitched at the top, I backstitched at the bottom, and my stitch line is 1/2 inch away from my raw edge. Now, the next step is to press open our seam allowance. So, to review vocab words, the space between the stitch line and the raw edge is our seam allowance. So I'm gonna open up my fabric and you wanna press it open. You can start by pressing it open with your fingers, but you're gonna take it over to the iron and press it open at the iron. Okay, great. This really smooths out our seam. The goal is when we're wearing our fabric, we don't want people to notice that we joined 2 pieces of fabric. We really want them to blend as one overall piece of fabric, I guess you can say. So by pressing open your seam allowances, it really gives it a nice, sharp, polished look. And it really does make your garments feel much more professional and not so homemade. So don't ever skip that step. I see a lot of beginners just, you know, they're just excited to sew and then they don't want to walk all the way over to the iron. Don't let that be you. Every time you sew a seam, get up, go press it, and it really will just make your garment look that much more professional.